All right, it is the week of December 4th, 2023, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to talk about three main things to get back in the swing of things since I was out for pretty much all of November. First, the real big one is we're going to talk about PFL acquiring Bellator. This is a huge deal in the space for many reasons, and we're going to talk about how this deal happened and a little bit of background about the deal. But what we're really going to focus on were comments made by PFL boss Don Davis stating that he believes with this acquisition, the PFL can become a true co-leader in the sport with the UFC. So 1A, 1B rather than number one UFC, number two PFL. That's a big statement. And that's right, ladies and gentlemen. We are going back to strategic competitive analysis. We're going to look at the revenue drivers for the PFL to how they can start to increase those and take away some of the UFC's market share. We're going to talk about resources the PFL has or what you would consider their product to really drive revenue and, raise those numbers. And then we're going to talk about the obstacles they have to overcoming some of the UFC's competitive advantages that have already been cultivated, right? UFC's been a market leader for decades now. They have certain strategic competitive advantages that PFL is going to have to find a way to overcome if they really want to become a co-leader. All in all, this is going to be a deep dive into this from a strategic perspective, and we're going to see if we can answer the question: can PFL, now that they've acquired Bellator, truly compete with the UFC? That's going to be our aim and goal for today. Then we're also going to talk about the Middle East, right? It's the new hotbed for combat sports. A lot of different quotes about how it's, the new capital of the fight world. I'm going to talk about why that is and how long fight for this region could go on, right? In terms of actual geographical size and population, it's not huge, but financially, it's literally a money pit. So, could this be the new eternal battleground for promoters, especially with PFL trying to go after the UFC? You got boxing in there, right? Lots of things going on. We're going to break all of that down. And then, last but not least, we need to talk about a UFC antitrust lawsuit update. There have been a couple of filings on both the plaintiff and uh, Endeavor side, including one to dismiss with an interesting reason by Endeavor, and a fair amount of exhibits have been uploaded. So we need to take a look at those, and it will tie back to our strategic competitive analysis that we do in the beginning of the show to kind of paint the picture of what the UFC is up against in terms of this antitrust allegation. So with that in mind, timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, first thing we're going to talk about in terms of the PFL acquiring Bellator is paint a little background here in terms of how this deal happened and some quotes from Don Davis, Dana White, and others. And then we're going to take a look at the revenue drivers the PFL has at its disposal to try and actually take away some of the UFC's market share. So, first up, in terms of the deal itself, some details there. Sportico reported that it was for less than $100 million. Now, that's less than the 200 to 500 million valuation that was out there for Bellator before. As I've said before, right, in terms of valuations, it's an art, not a science. You get to tie so much of the valuation to fundamentals, which is always true. But when you get into future revenue earnings and IP properties and a lot of these intangibles, it becomes very much an art, and you get some valuations that are just very pumped up or sometimes a little bit lower than they should be, but usually pumped up because it's about selling, right? Most of the time, somebody is getting their valuation out there is because they're looking to purchase something else and they want to borrow money from a bank or a particular investment fund or what have you. Or it's to sell and say, like, hey, this is what we're worth. Like, if you want to come buy us, you should probably pay us this much. So it's not shocking to me that Bellator was valued around 200 to 500 million at one point, only to be sold for less than 100 million. I believe it's still pretty close to 100 million, right? We're not talking like 75 or 60, but nevertheless, it's far below what that valuation was. So not super shocking. It was mostly a stock transaction, right? Not cash. So that makes some difference, right? It's not that PFL gave Viacom CBS just a buttload of cash and was like, "Hey, we'll take Bellator off your hands." But even so, it being stock versus cash, because cash is always better generally. Um, Viacom purchased Bellator, I believe, back in 2011 or so, for around $50 million. So to nearly double their investment over the course of 12 years is not bad, right? It's not that they lost a ton of money or they only got like a 5 or 10% return. I mean, that's a pretty good return, especially over the time frame. So not bad at all, especially considering Viacom was pretty publicly looking to sell and get out of the combat sports market. I mean, they're getting rid of Showtime, right? Showtime Boxing is gone. It's kind of a new world out there for media companies where they're looking to cut as much of the unnecessary as possible, lean up, right? As they say, and clearly Viacom thought that Bellator and Showtime should be next, and to get that much for Bellator, even in stock, is not a bad call given the current market and the way things are right now. So, not a terrible deal for Viacom at all. In terms of PFL, the reason that they purchased this company is pretty apparent. And that is what PFL boss Don Davis stated on the MMA Hour with Ariel Hawani. Some quotes here. Quote, everybody knows Dana White, well enough that he only dismisses things that worry him or else he just doesn't comment. He didn't comment on the PFL for 4 years because he wasn't worried. He commented on the PFL a lot in the last 6 months. You're worried. What specifically worried him about Bellator is the metrics we put on the press release. 30% of that roster ranked in the top 25 per fight matrix rankings. It says not Dana gets to rank his own guys. Don's ranking his own guys. There's only one group that ranks all fighters, Fight Matrix, independently. 30% of the UFC roster is top 25 ranked, and now our combined company of PFL and Bellator are 30% the same. He goes on to say, right, that UFC does have the top 5 in the world, and that's really the difference, right? Don Davis is not wrong with that comment that they both have around 30% based on Fight Matrix, but UFC obviously has the top or more of the top 25 than PFL does now, even with Bellator's acquisition. That's a lot of what we'll get into in the antitrust lawsuit exhibits as to how they were able to lock down those fighters and have so many of them under the promotions wing. But, a thing we need to call out here, right? Fight Matrix is independent, but it's also not infallible. There are a couple rankings on Fight Matrix that will make you scratch your head. I forget specifically. I believe middleweight has some wonky rankings, and just some areas. But it is more independent than it's true. It's far more independent than the UFC or PFL's rankings, and it has been used for a while as kind of a more independent call because I believe fans can pretty much vote, and it's kind of like a fan consensus. But it's not infallible. I just want to throw that out there, right? It's not just like highly trained panel of fighters and media and so on and so. It's open to interpretation, like any rankings are, right? It's never going to be perfect, but just want to call that out because I've seen some comments about Fight Matrix being this like gold standard, and it's like, well, I mean, it's better than a promotion's own rankings, but yeah. With that in mind, Davis goes on to say UFC ain't the NFL. We're not the XFL, but he wants to think that. And it's just a matter of time before that starts to get more well known. Then we're not number 2, we're co-leader. He doesn't want that. That's what's going on. You know, that's a bold statement. It's not we're number 2, it's we're co-leader. And that's really a huge part of this acquisition is to get more top-ranked fighters under their umbrella to hopefully compete and go against the UFC head to head rather than kind of being the number 2 league and being okay with that. Um, and this is also very important here. This is a big sales pitch by Don Davis too. This is him saying like, look, we're going to be number 2. We've got all these great fighters. This is great. This is a great sales pitch for sponsors and for more money from, say, the Qatar Investment Authority, right? Where that's helped them acquire Bellator and is now one of their main backers. It's sales. A lot of this is just selling. It's not saying like, oh, we're gonna destroy the UFC and do all this just for the sake of like I wholeheartedly believe this. All this. It's a lot of selling as well, right? Um, and it's a scenario too where Dana White reacted and essentially said, "Good for them." It's effing hilarious, right? I wish them all the luck in the world. He specifically said one, you know, S organization that sells no tickets and nobody watches buys another S organization sells no tickets and nobody watches. Sounds like a F winner to me. Woo. I mean, that's the UFC stance on it, and that's probably should be their stance, right? They don't want to give credence to those claims. They don't want to say like this is a real challenge. Like this is all blustering. We don't care. We're the UFC, right? This is what we do. Um, it's and when pressed further about a merger, right? And shout out to Matt Wells, former Body Lock boy, for asking Dana about this. But White said, what do you think of their ticket sales? What do you think of their TV ratings in terms of, if PFL could be a true threat? That's important because, as we'll get to in terms of our revenue drivers, those are important for challenging the UFC's market share. Um, it sounds like they're going to keep them independent, right? Which I kind of thought they probably would. And they're going to do a champion versus champion uh, type of card, which makes a lot of sense, right? So go through the PFL and you're a tournament winner. You fight the corresponding Bellator champion that exists. They may only keep the PFL weight classes, so you may see some divisions get cut by Bellator. That wouldn't be shocking. I mean, you'll definitely see more people leave Bellator. I know Michael Venom Page is pretty much left. I believe he's rumored to fight here soon, and I know others that are talking about leaving, if not already out the door, which makes sense, right? It's a new company, a new structure. Even though you're going to keep Bellator going on, it, their changes will come, and some people won't like those changes. So it's not shocking that fighters will leave. Um, but yeah, that's kind of the background of this deal. And next, we're going to dive into the actual drivers of revenue for how the PFL can make that statement of becoming co-leader a reality. All right, so let's talk about the specific revenue drivers the PFL will look to pull the levers on to try and become a co-leader with the UFC in the MMA space. And keep in mind, co-leader can you could define that many ways, but in this instance, and the way I believe Don Davis was probably referencing, right, is really financially or popularity wise, right? Um, think WWE, WCW ratings war, Monday Night Wars, even WWE, AEW to an extent, right? Just popularity, brand power, those types of things. So there are four main revenue drivers that you know will kind of be the eye test to is PFL truly gaining ground and taking away some of the UFC's market share? Because right now, as it stands, the UFC pretty much dominates the entire market, right? In terms of total market share that the UFC holds, I don't want to put a specific percentage on it, but like a range, right? Like probably 95 to somewhere between 95 and 99% of the MMA market if you're talking about financially, right? Like no other company is putting up the numbers they are in terms of TV ratings, in terms of pay-per-view buys. I mean, they're miles ahead. right? And they're the only profitable one that we know of. We know Bellator was profitable at a point, and then more recently learned that they weren't when they were sold. We know the PFL is not profitable yet. They've talked about becoming profitable soon. I believe in the next 18 months is something what Don Davis said, something around those lines. It's a little tough in that regard because again, it, they're forecasting profitability uh, in 12 to 18-month windows all the time. One championship does this too. Whether or not that's actually hit or not, well, that's a different statement. But in this case, um, we're going to look at, what are the big revenue drivers and financial drivers that PFL can use to kind of show us the outside world, okay, they're starting to take on some of the audience and that's translating into a greater amount of revenue, which means they're getting a larger share of the market. The way I look at this, right, when it comes to the MMA industry, and I'm not infallible here, so I could easily be missing something. If I am, call me out on it. I definitely want to be called out on. But the four main prongs I see of revenue, or four main revenue drivers, right? I see for the PFL are media rights, pay per view buys, sponsorships, and live gate. So we'll start with media rights, which is probably the most important, right? They just inked a multi year deal with ESPN, which is huge, right? We talked about a while back when they got their original ESPN deal, and then they got another deal with ESPN that was for just another couple of years. That second deal may not have been what they wanted, just because there had been some talk about them, going out and getting a much bigger deal in terms of media rights, and that didn't seem to be the case. There didn't seem to be a huge appetite for it, given the market and given what PFL had done so far. That's not entirely surprising, but clearly wasn't what they wanted. But here, this deal with ESPN is a very big deal. Um, Mostly because we know that the UFC doesn't care to be on the same network as them, regardless of what they may say in other areas. According to what I've heard from, and again, what I hear is always, you know, take me as the very first level of like rumor. Like it's not always a big grain of salt. But you'll see others say this as well. UFC is not super loving being on the same network as PFL. They don't like that because there's a possible exposure risk, right? Of okay, I go to watch a UFC fight, great. Fights are done. I still want more MMA. Oh, guess what? PFL is here on ESPN Plus. I'm going to check that out too. Or I'm getting the same targeted advertising because it's both coming through ESPN Plus, who wants me to get on their app, and I'm seeing like, what, it's Friday, and I really, really want to watch MMA, but maybe there's no UFC card this weekend, or maybe the card this weekend is one that is in China and starts at a super early hour, so I really don't want to deal with that, or I'm gonna have to wait to see it anyway, and it's not gonna be live, it's not gonna be the same. But what's on tonight is the PFL championships, or a crucial part of the playoffs. Like, all right, and I'm getting targeted ads for that. That's not what the UFC loves to see in terms of a potential competitor getting that same advertising targeting, literally the same advertising targeting that they have, because it's going through the same media partner. In terms of the money behind this deal, uh, this is something where, you know, um, numbers, I was hoping I'd be able to find something more solid to report. I've heard some numbers, but I do not feel comfortable saying them because they could be very off. Because again, I am like line one when it comes to this stuff. Um, but I will say that I think it's something that they're happy with, right? Like PFL CEO Peter Murray said in a quote, we've had 4 successful seasons with ESPN with major audience growth, 30% year over year, and we will continue to grow. Um, and it's nowhere near what the UFC is getting, of course, but You know, ESPN gets their pay-per-view distribution as well, which is big. What I've heard is PFL execs are happy. I'll put it that way. I don't know how happy, and again, I've heard multiple different things, but it's just important to know that they are happy. Heard last time when they did a deal, I had heard that it wasn't bad, but it wasn't what they wanted. Right, this time seems to be trending in a better direction for them. That much I feel comfortable saying. Um, So that's big, right? Media rights moving forward, you want to see that year over year growth. The ratings are up for PFL too, right? Their championship ratings and this past season before, the ratings are stronger. They've shown a strong growth in the ratings. I remember I wrote an article a long time ago for Sherdog about how PFL needed their playoffs to be a big home run. And I know some people took it the wrong way and thought I was bashing the PFL, but really I was just kind of saying, like, look, from a business perspective, you kind of need this. And they did. And they have proven that year over year they are growing and the ratings are going up. That's huge for them because again, they're getting bigger sponsorships. They've got, the Qatar Investment Authority giving them money so they can acquire Bellator and bolster their roster and then hold the, PFL versus Bellator championship card, which I think is their best shot at getting good pay-per-view numbers too. It's all about having the right data to show in sales presentations and being able to take that data and sell it correctly. And they've shown growth. And that's really, if you ever listen to anyone go to a private equity firm or, people wonder like how did FTX, the crypto thing, become so huge? How did WeWork become so huge? So many pitches to giant funds of money, whether it be private equity, whether it be a government fund, whether it be a bank. So many pitches revolve around year over year growth and projections that again are wildly forecasted, right? Like they expect 180% year over year growth that's going to be sustained for the next 5 years. Like, well, maybe. And sometimes that does happen, right? Like in some scenarios, you get Facebook, everybody's trying to find that unicorn. That's what all the private equity firms are trying to do. They're trying to find that unicorn that they hope will turn into another Facebook or another Twitter before recent events or, um, you know, or another UFC, right? Look what happened with Zuffa purchasing UFC and then Endeavor purchasing the UFC. They're looking for that growth. So that's the numbers to rely on. And the fact that ratings have gotten better, and that's just lineal ratings, right? That doesn't count ESPN plus specific views. That's a huge plus for the PFL. Uh, and media rights is again where you want to have the bulk of your money. The UFC figured this out when they made the deal with ESPN to go from a very variable revenue business, depending on how well is this pay-per-view buy going to pay-per-view going to sell them on terms of buys or not. And we've got to push big stars like Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey and we have to maybe acquiesce to them sometimes because we need that revenue. Instead, they went to we're getting so much revenue from just our media deal that we can lay down the law and we can actually suppress certain costs. We don't need to pay you this amount, fighter, and if you don't like it, well, too bad because we're fine. And oops, this event didn't do super well in pay-per-view buys. Great. Doesn't matter to us. The next one did. Perfect. We get a little bit more on top of our nice, steady revenue stream, right? That's a huge part of it. So media rights is the biggest driver by far. And the fact they inked a new deal with ESPN is huge. Um, and I think it could lead to some good things, right? Depending on how this new acquisition goes and how ratings go, this is a good start for them, especially after getting the investments they needed from Qatar and acquiring Bellator and getting some of the sponsorships, right? Um, that's another huge driver and one we could just jump to right now. in fact, is sponsorships. That's probably the second biggest driver. I know a lot of people want to go pay-per-view buys, but that was, and pay-per-view buys are important, especially for a company like PFL. Don't get me wrong. They are still very much in the phase that UFC was, where pay-per-view buys are going to be crucial to them if they're going to use that model, right? That's where they can get a substantial amount more revenue than they already have, because their media rights are locked in, but they're not going to, pay for everything, right? You've got $6 million champions plus other production costs, all that stuff for each season. And then you've got other tournaments, other things you've got to go that you're doing. You need to probably find a more sensitive lever, which would be pay-per-view buys in this case, or in order to really get the revenue you probably want. But that being said, sponsorships are the biggest important factor in my mind, because second biggest next to media rights, because they are very much like media rights in that they're set, right? X amount of years, X amount of dollars per year. It doesn't matter how well our pay-per-views do. It doesn't matter how many people tune into our events. You agree for 6 years to pay me X amount of money, or 3 years, X amount of money, millions of dollars. And that's the foundation, right? This is between the media rights and the sponsorships. That's going to keep the lights on. That's going to help, take care of most, if not all of our costs in an ideal world, all of our costs, and then some, give us a modest profit. But that's going to take care of the majority of our costs and our overhead, is the media rights and sponsorships. So those are the two most important in my mind, because they're the foundation. And then as I was starting to go, and I kind of wrapped back around, uh, the path of pay-per-view buys being the next most important, right? Because that's where you can really get explosive growth if you're the PFL. That's where, okay, if I've got sponsorships and media rights totaling, let's say, $20 million, and that covers, our $6 million champions plus other fighter costs plus production costs. And again, I'm just making up numbers here. I have no actual insight into PFL financials, but let's say costs per year end up being, with, advertising and marketing, and now acquiring Bellator and all that stuff. Let's say per year you're looking at, 21 million or something. So you're only a million in the hole, which isn't terrible, honestly. If and that's just from media rights and sponsorship. If you want to have a year where you have explosive growth and you make, $60 million in profit, your most sensitive lever. And when we talk about sensitivity, right, it's something it's the variable that you change that has the greatest effect. That's pay-per-view buys for the PFL right now. Right? If they go out there and they put on a show and sell, they don't even have to sell a million. I mean, a million would be massive for them. Don't get me wrong, especially at $50 or whatever. That's huge. But imagine they put on a pay-per-view where even they sell, 300,000, 30% of that at $50. So that's still a fair amount of money, right? I mean, that's still 15 million or so. That's huge. That's huge. 300K buys would be $15 million for them, which definitely covers their fighter costs and probably most of their overhead production. And because again, they're not putting on shows every week like the UFC is. They're not going out every single week and traveling a lot, doing all this stuff, or paying for fighters to come in every single week. No, they're doing it far less per year in the seasons um, format, and their overhead is going to be significantly less than you know UFC or even Bellator to an extent. I mean, now that they've acquired Bellator, they still got that overhead, but it sounds like they're going to cut back on some events. And yeah, I mean, a 300K pay-per-view buy would be massive for them, because that's just one event, right? And if they were able to do 300K once, they'd probably be able to find a way to at least get 100K or 50 to 100K on average, which would be huge, probably in the long run. because that could lead to profitability. And profitability is step, 2 or 3 in terms of really trying to compete with the UFC. So pay-per-view is going to be the most sensitive lever by far. Um, but that being said, it's not necessarily the most important because you need that foundation first, right? You need the media rights and the sponsorship. The other one that I haven't talked about much here, but I will mention because again, it could be big for the PFL is Livegate, right? We've talked about, Livegate being less and less important to the UFC, but UFC Austin, where they were just, in my hometown, and they made a huge amount of money. And it was nuts looking at those prices, to be honest. But they made a huge amount of money. They were sold out. And that type of gate for the PFL, again, just for where they are in terms of maturity, would be big. Now that they've acquired Bellator, their costs are going to rise. So they're going to need gates to be better than they probably, you know, have been historically. And that's something that I'm sure they're going to work on. But I mean, it's going to be much more of a factor in the PFL's financials than, say, the UFC. It's not going to be the end all be all, right? If you have a terrible live gate, that's probably more indicative of where your pay per view buys are, which isn't going to be great. And media rights may be affected too, just because of advertising and sponsors, right? That nobody wants to put on a show that, you know, shows a half empty arena. That's not necessarily great, but it's not going to be anywhere near the main focus. That's kind of the cherry on top to the sundae. If you get great live gate, awesome. That can affect in a very positive way and be meaningful. You get bad live gate, it can meaningfully impact you negatively, but it's not it's the least sensitive price lever in many ways, I would say, right? Um, you could argue media rights and sponsorships are because they're set once they're set, but those negotiations, I would say, are pretty sensitive and can be pretty big. Whereas Livegate, it's it will vary, and it will be indicative of how well PFL and Bellator are doing. It will be used as a metric, just as it is in pro wrestling and boxing, right? But it's not nearly as impactful as the other three. Important, but not nearly as impactful. But those are the four main revenue drivers I see. And that's really, you could throw in merch, but I mean, merch is pretty much non-existent, right? PFL is not going to compete with the UFC because they've sold 10 million PFL hats, right, or replica belts. If that happens, sure, but you get what I'm saying there. Merch is there, but again, not nearly as significant as the other four. Those are the four main prongs. You want to have live gate up because that again is probably a good barometer or at least connected to how well your pay-per-views are doing, and it's also something that will affect your media rights when your media partner sees the arenas, and just the popularity of your product and your brand, which is big. So that's what I see as the four main revenue drivers. Next, we're going to talk about the actual resources the PFL has in order to make that revenue. What product or service, right, do they have to actually drive revenue? So, in my infinite wisdom, and because I'm transparent, um, I just realized I've been calling revenue streams revenue drivers. These are actually revenue drivers, but we're going to call them resources here, right? Just for the sake of me being a fool. But yes, if you're talking about traditional revenue streams and revenue drivers, these would be the revenue drivers. That would be the revenue streams we just talked about. I'm going to call them revenue drivers and resources. Product, direct inputs into revenue is what this is. So, with that in mind, let's talk about what direct inputs PFL has to make money. Again, I see four main things that can help them lead to those particular revenue streams of media rights, pay-per-view buys, sponsorships, and live gate. First and most obvious one is fighters, right? Obviously, you need fighters to have fights. Everything Don Davis said in his press release and his interview on the MMA Hour centered around having the right group of fighters, and 30% of the fight matrix independently ranked fighters to challenge the UFC and become a co-leader. That's been clear from their messaging since day one of this acquisition, and what we all kind of suspected why PFL would purchase Bellator. So fighters are a huge part of this. Obviously, you want to have stars. You want to have people highly ranked because if you have the best fighters in the world in your roster, people are going to want to tune in, going to want to pay for pay-per-views to watch them fight, going to become fan favorites, and hopefully you get a Conor McGregor or a Ronda Rousey. And, something of those along those lines, because obviously they made a ridiculous amount of money for the UFC in terms of pay-per-view buys. So, fighters is a huge, huge part, if not the centerpiece of the PFL's current resources and revenue drivers, direct inputs. Brand. Brand is also very, very important, right? If the UFC has been able to demonstrate anything over the past 10 years, especially, it's that brand power has an effect. Perception is very important. We've heard from multiple fighters say, I want to fight the best in the world. I want to go to the UFC. That's where the best in the world are. And again, if you look at the independent rankings, for the most part, that is true. But there are other organizations, say PFL, Bellator, One, Ryzen, that technically in some divisions you could say, no, the best in the world might be there, right? I mean, 145 or really 155 and 145. 145 is a little bit tricky because of the Nunes situation. But now that Nunes is retired, let's say that 145, Chris Cyborg and Bellator, right? Has the best. 155, women's, obviously. Kayla Harrison is pretty much regarded as the best. You had Larissa Pacheco, right? Like, that's a whole another scenario. But for the longest time, either way, PFL has as the top 155 women's fighters, right? If you're looking at light heavyweight, men's light heavyweight, there's an argument that, Nemkov could easily be the top 205 guy, especially with Jones moving up to heavyweight and looking at the way the landscape has changed in the UFC. It's very possible. There are arguments to be made, is my point, right? And the fact that there are still so many fighters that say, no, I want to fight the best of the best in the world. I don't care about pay. It's about legacy. I want to go to the UFC. That's all branding. And you have I train UFC instead of I train MMA. And you have UFC fans. You don't have a ton of just pure hardcore Bellator or PFL fans, right? You have pure hardcore UFC fans. Everything outside of UFC is non-existent or is, inferior, right? That's a huge, huge thing in the MMA community, just like it is in pro wrestling. Very similar, although at least in pro wrestling, right? Even then, you have, this WWE, AEW stuff going on where there are two brands and you have fan bases that are adamant about both. You don't even see that much in MMA. You don't have a ton of people that are like Bellator and PFL is way better than UFC, or One is like the best organization in the world. You see some of it, but not nearly as much. And again, that's part of just because of how dominant the UFC has been and the brand that UFC's had. I mean, if we're comparing what MMA looks like compared to pro wrestling, pro wrestling for a long time, it was WWE, and then you had like TNA Impact or some of these other smaller promotions, Ring of Honor, which were like known, but weren't even in the same conversation. right? That's kind of what it feels like in the current landscape of MMA, and that's part of what PFL is trying to challenge, right? They're trying to say, nope, that's not how it's going to be anymore. We're not going to be the clear number two. We're going to try and become a co-leader. So brand, very, very, very important. Maybe the most important. We'll talk about branding more in obstacles. Media partners, another revenue driver and resource for the PFL. Obviously, media rights and getting advertising. I mean, there's not much more to say that I didn't talk about in the previous section where your media partner is massive. They help do all your advertising, they help do a bunch of marketing, they help sell you to advertisers. They're massive. And then the last but not least, you know, I would say other partnerships. And that may be networking, you know, it, other partnerships can come in many different forms. An example might be, right, that the UFC's deal with Saudi Arabia happened because of the TKO merger where Vince McMahon kind of got the two parties introduced and was a big part in getting that deal done, right? So, yeah, your company that you're in under this TKO entity introduced you and got a deal done with Saudi Arabia when, you know, previously after a lot of the, you know, the Jamal Khashoggi stuff, I mean, Endeavor had pulled out of doing any deals with Saudi Arabia. So Vince McMahon's, you know, ability to smooth that over and kind of rekindle that partnership is important. And that's an example of another partnership. Um, it can also be certain brands introducing you to other brands, right? Like if are you have a sponsor, let's say in the drink industry, right? Like let's say it's Monster for the UFC, or in this case, let's say it's Gatorade for PFL. Let's say PFL got a sponsorship from Gatorade, right? And then they have brand activations where it's like, oh, okay, like, you know, I'm trying to think of, you know, if you go to a UFC show and then they have all those things that you can go like get pictures with, or you play a little game where you throw stuff through the Modelo or whatever, right? Like stuff that they do in International Fight Week, outside of autographs, right? Like brand activations and other things like special discounts. Let's say you have that going on with Gatorade and PFL, and then Gatorade also has the sponsorship with, I don't know, Nike. And again, I'm just making up companies here, but you know, through the brand activations, you end up meeting and having similar brand activations where they're doing something with Nike and with you guys, and they end up talking to you. They introduce you to Nike. Well, suddenly PFL and Nike get on the same page with clothing, and they're like, "Oh, you know what? This could be a good deal. Maybe we could figure this out." Because again, it's all sales meetings. So it's all a bunch of people talking business, getting drunk, going to dinners, right? But it's just who you know, not what you know. And next thing you know, there's a PFL Nike apparel deal. I mean, those partnerships can lead to a lot of new revenue and more sponsors. Not always how it happens, obviously, right? It's not all interconnected, but you've got lots of different industries that complement each other, and you're able to kind of build off of those compliments, especially if you have good relationships with one, right? It's just how it works. It's networking. It's what it is its core is networking in a lot of ways, and that's what a lot of sales is. So that's another resource the PFL has at their disposal, where if they get the right media partners, the right sponsors, they can parlay that into more sponsors, into more relationships that could benefit them, right? So those are the four main resources. Again, I'm prone to make mistakes. Already made some calling revenue streams revenue drivers, but if I left any out here, let me know. But those are the four main avenues I see the PFL utilizing to drive revenue to challenge the UFC. Let me know your thoughts on that as well. All right. So now we get to go into the competitive landscape and do some strategic competitive analysis. So we know what PFL has in terms of resources and revenue drivers, and we know the different revenue streams that the PFL can use to try and take some of UFC's market share. And we know that if we're comparing PFL to the UFC in these categories, UFC has some pretty big competitive advantages in quite a few of them. So again, to remind everyone, because it's been a while since I've done competitive analysis, strategic competitive analysis video. We're following former McKinsey partner Kevin Coyne's methodology here that a company is able to gain a competitive advantage either through one of two methods. One, value, right? You have to have something of value that customers want to buy. In this case, access to the best mixed martial arts competitions in the world. Um, Asymmetry, which means that one company has an advantage in providing that value over another. And then method one is cost dynamics, which means that you have an asymmetry as a company, something that allows you to reduce your costs in a way that you can make more profit per unit, right? So basically, you're able to produce something of value at a cheaper rate than your competitor, or able to extract more profit, sell something higher for whatever reason, and really just extract more profit, right, than a competitor, or scarcity, which means you have a particular resource that your competitor does not have access to. You have an asymmetrical ability to have a resource that provides more value than your competitor. Your quality is thus higher, and you're able to extract more profit and value, which lends you a competitive advantage in that regard. The UFC has multiple competitive advantages that utilize both of these methods. Um, the biggest ones, though, that are obstacles for the PFL, right, um, are first scarcity of fighters, which has been a long-standing conversation uh, in the marketplace for a while now, right? I mean, that's the whole basis of the antitrust lawsuit, right? Is that the UFC unfairly locked a large amount of top tier MMA fighters in the world into exclusive long contracts that they controlled, and thus created a scarcity for that resource and a massive asymmetry for them, so that they were the ones clearly putting on the best product in the world, and thus would be able to take a larger market share. Because if I have $50 and I can either watch, you know, two of the number one and number two ranked MMA fighters go at it versus number seven and number nine, probably going number one and number two, right? So that is the whole basis of the antitrust lawsuit with monopoly power, and really what it boils down to is, again, UFC locking up a lot of the highest ranked fighters in the world into exclusive contracts. Uh, Even though there's been some changes, outside of the class period, which would have ended in 2016, 2017, right? You had the sunset clause. Now that's kind of been reversed essentially, but you had the sunset clause added for a bit, which allowed Francis Ngannou to leave and go to PFL, which is a huge win for them. But you still have the UFC again, as even Don Davis admitted, having the majority of the top five fighters in the world. And that means that they have an asymmetrical access to that scarce resource, right? So that's huge competitive advantage number one. Um, Competitive advantage number two is a little bit trickier in that it is the UFC's brand power, right? The UFC using that first competitive advantage to become this global powerhouse to either buy up other competing promotions which again we'll get to here in the antitrust lawsuit update, or to put other promotions out of business because they couldn't get the revenue needed with the UFC dominating the market so much. Through that competitive advantage of having the scarcity to top tier fighters, that allowed them to build a brand, a global brand that has really led to another scarcity type competitive advantage of reaching customer segments that are highly sought after and hard to get to, that they pretty much have full control over, right? Um, when we talk about the different customer segments that the UFC tracks, I mentioned this on many podcasts before. We're talking about 8 or so. I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine PFL, Bellator, One, Ryzen, right, don't have nearly as many customer segments. Or if they were to slice the data the exact same way, they're really only hitting 1 or 2 segments, right? They're not hitting that 7th or 8th customer who is, tuning in only for the big fights, or is a diehard Conor McGregor fan and no one else, right? Um, that one's a little bit tricky because it's tied to a fighter rather than the actual company. But think about the customer segment that maybe isn't that far out and is instead like, oh, I'm going to watch the big UFC fight, or, oh, like, do you train UFC, right? It's permeated the zeitgeist enough that the UFC equates to MMA for a large amount of people. It's hard for us as hardcore fans, and I know you're a hardcore if you're listening and watching this. It's hard for us to remember just how niche of a sport this is, right? It's grown, it's gotten bigger, people know more about it, but it's still a pretty niche sport. And the UFC is really the one that's grown and permeated out into those other customer segments. It's like Kleenex, right? Kleenex is not the name of facial tissue. It is the name of a brand that is just was that popular. You say Kleenex. There are people that never say, I say Kleenex. I don't say like, oh, I need a tissue. I say Kleenex half the time, right? Because again, they just were able to get to the market early enough and essentially say, we equal this, that competition doesn't even register in certain consumers' minds. And that's a huge obstacle the PFL has if they want to become co-leader, right? You can talk about live gate, you can talk about pay-per-view buys, media rights. Sure. All of that circles back to getting more customers to purchase your service. And the UFC took their first competitive advantage of being the best in the world to a point where they got rid of their competition, and that's everything that's known. It's still out there in, say, WWE, right? AEW and the rise of that promotion was big in the sense of now you have a lot more people at least recognizing, oh, like there's this other thing out there. But for the longest time, everybody was like, oh, doing WWE moves on them or doing whatever and not pro wrestling, right? It's the same thing here. PFL's trying to get to that AEW level. And I keep using pro wrestling, one, because it's something I'm familiar with, but two, because it does tie into TKO, and it will continue to tie in, trust me. But when you look at what the UFC has, they have a scarcity of brand recognition, a scarcity of knowledge about the sport, where are in entire customer segments where there is no such thing as MMA, there's just UFC. And it's up to PFL to essentially educate those customers and to know there actually is that, like, UFC does not equal MMA. UFC is just one brand of MMA. Here, check out our brand of MMA. It's worth your money too. And that is a tough, tough task. I would argue it is the hardest task of all, for the PFL in trying to become a co-leader. Because when you look at, let's say, fighters, right? I think there are two examples that show just how hard it's going to be for PFL to really become a true co-leader, um, because of UFC's reach and brand recognition. And those two fighters would be one from PFL, which is Kayla Harrison, and another from Bellator, which is AJ McKee. If you look at AJ McKee's run in Bellator, his first run, right? Up to him getting the belt, the tournament, TKOing Pitbull, who was and still is regarded essentially as the greatest of all time in Bellator. Um, AJ McKee's run was fantastic. He looked invincible. And you can go look at the articles. There were multiple media members, MMA media members, like jumping up and down, being like, this is crazy. He's a new star. It's going to be awesome. It feels like another McGregor moment, right? When he won at the Forum in LA and the confetti coming down, it was a huge celebration. It's like, it feels like another, like this is a new McGregor moment, but it never went anywhere. It never did. And then you look at Kayla Harrison, right? She was so dominant at 155, and she was being touted as the next Ronda and just crushing people left and right. And she was the PFL's gem. And for a long time, media was reporting on the PFL. It usually revolved around Kayla Harrison. It wasn't talking about the tournament itself or what's going on. I mean, Kayla Harrison was the star of the promotion, right? But you get to the pay-per-view buys, their first pay-per-view, and numbers were not great, right? Like, and it was Kayla Harrison as the star, and you had a bunch of people kind of flabbergasted, being like, why didn't this work, right? Why wasn't this another Ronda Rousey? She had the appearance, she had the it factor. Same with AJ McKee. I mean, he's looking fantastic. He's good on the mic. He's able to do why isn't it translating? And the key factor was reach, right? How many people were watching AJ McKee win that tournament? I forget what the exact ratings were, but it was pretty much in line with regular Bellator ratings, or slightly above. Like, I think like 317K or something in that range, maybe, which at the time for Bellator was good, right? Because they've been in the 200s and been kind of waffling. PFL, same type of thing, like 10,000 people. But if you looked at the ratings of the show, that were all free, where you kind of could look at Kayla's background and all that, they were in the 200s, 300s. They were again growth, which was important, but compare that to the UFC ratings, which when they were on Fox, which was massive, right? Huge for them. I think it was 9 or 12 million households at one point. In their debut, like, and during their heyday, when they were consistently hitting millions viewers easy. I mean, the prelims now still on ESPN, still hitting million plus easy. They had a much wider reach. You didn't have enough people watching AJ McKee's rise or Kayla Harrison's rise. And it didn't translate the same way. With Conor and Ronda, right? Ronda was right in smack dab in what became, kind of the popular era of MMA, where everybody was, wearing tap out shirts, and it was, you go to a Buffalo Wild Wings, it was on every Buffalo Wild Wings. It was like, whoa. And they had that growth where, again, they were first to the market. They were the only thing to the market. It was the niche sport. And they were in households. Conor, they were there already, but he had the swag, he had all that stuff. He had Ireland behind him. And again, you have these clips, and it was easy enough to watch MMA or hear about it because UFC was pretty much it. I mean, Bellator was around at that point, but still, it wasn't, and so was one. But UFC had an actual good television deal where they were on in a lot of households. So if you heard about Conor McGregor, well, I can go watch him on Fox, or I can go watch him on FS1, which is on a lot of cable packages and is in, I don't know how many millions of homes, but it makes a massive, massive difference, right? The reach was there. And now you look at PFL and Bellator and the fact that, okay, they're going to have an ESPN deal. They'll probably be shown more on ESPN, but it's getting those other customer segments is so hard. Like those people already don't spend money regularly on MMA, right? Hardcores are hardcores. That's great, but hardcores do not sustain these companies. It's the third, fourth, fifth, seventh segment of the UFC's customer breakdown that really help to drive revenue and drive pay-per-view buys. And even that, like they're struggling on those too with the increase in pay-per-view buy price and all of that. Like I mean, pay-per-view buys are down significantly from where they used to be. I mean, sure, you get a McGregor card, you get certain, yeah, but unless you have a star, I mean, pay-per-view buys aren't killing it. We know that, at least in 2022, it was Gaethje. I think it's 2022, but with Gaethje, Oliveira was the biggest pay-per-view buy at 400K, which isn't the worst, but it's not like what it used to be. It's not 700K buys or what it used to be. And that, again, is indicative of your larger audience. And ratings for PFL going up again, important and hopeful. But that brand is going to be so hard to shake. You get people who already spend so little of their money on MMA to get them to say, you know what? You either need to spend more than you normally do and spend more time, right? Because it's not just money, it's time too. They don't regularly watch MMA. They'll watch big fights, otherwise they don't care that much about it. You've got to convince them to either spend more time and watch them, or you have to watch PFL in addition to UFC, or you have to convince them to watch PFL instead of UFC. And you've already got a fighter resource constraint on you there, but it's tough. It's tough, man. It's also not the same as say WWE, where okay, you've got people who really love this WWE superstar and they want to see them fight all the time. You have that occasionally, obviously McGregor, Rousey, John Jones, etc. But for the most part, you have an organization fan base. It's not tied to a specific person, and that's what the UFC wants. The UFC wants to be bigger than the individual fighters because if fans are tied to just an individual fighter, that means they go to the PFL and they're only spending so much time and money on one MMA organization. Well, then that means they're most likely going to follow their favorite fighter and not care about where they're fighting, right? So, and you see this in wrestling, right? You see in wrestling all the time. Um, that's the opposite of what UFC wants. And that's why they don't care about building stars as much anymore. Yes, stars would be great for them in terms of adding extra money, getting better media rights. Sure. But they don't need them. And in some ways, they'd prefer not to have them. Instead, just be like, you want to see the heavyweight champion in the UFC fight and defend their title. Doesn't matter what their name is, doesn't matter. You just want to see that event. You want to be a UFC fan, not a Jose Aldo fan, not a Francis Ngannou fan. That's what the UFC would prefer. That's part of the reason they don't acquiesce to some of these demands and why they don't push people. Everybody's like, why didn't he market so and so much and do all of it? They don't want to anymore. They need them to be just marketable enough to be interesting and connect with the viewer, but not so marketable that they become bigger than the organization. Because if you make 3 Conor McGregors in the UFC and they all leave, then you are at risk of actually having your bottom line affected. And that's the last thing they want. So those are the 2 biggest obstacles in my mind is first trying to get the fighters that are needed, and then also brand recognition. And it's a catch-22 because you need the fighters in order to get the brand recognition, right? So that's tough. You have to have enough compelling fighters that people are going to want to watch your product versus the UFC, or in addition to when they're already, again, limited on time or money. Best way to do that is to get recognizable big name fighters under your banner, and that's hard when the UFC has that competitive advantage of asymmetry and scarcity of the top fighters in the world, hence the antitrust lawsuit. So how do they overcome that? Now that we've kind of analyzed this through, how does the UFC lose market share to PFL? Frankly, the best thing PFL can do is, again, get more Ngannous if it's possible, um, and work on growing their viewership through ESPN, sure, but there's not much else they can actually pull. And that's the real crux of it for the PFL, and why I don't think the UFC is really worried right now. The antitrust lawsuit is really what could torpedo all this, right? Suddenly all these fighters become free agents. They've got the Qatari Investment Authority behind them. If they're able to go to and say, like, look, we need to pay these fighters a ton. And we know the UFC is beholden to stockholders, right? So they can't just blow. Everybody's like, well, they're making all this money. They could pay more on fighters. They could, but that would tank their stock because a huge selling point of their stock is that, again, they are extremely profitable. And so, and that they pay dividends and things like that. So, best case scenario for the PFL is antitrust lawsuit goes real sideways for the UFC. Non-competes are null and void, and the PFL is able to offer fighters a huge amount of money just to get them away for the UFC. And you get enough champions that it really changes the landscape. And it gets into the media too, right? Like there'd be massive news stories about it. It would be a whole thing. That's the PFL's best hope. Without that, I don't know how they compete. I don't really think they can at the level that they want. At least not anytime soon. Long term, maybe. Right? Long term, you slowly start to build up your name. You get more and more UFC vets or recognizable names, hopefully in their prime, which is real tough because that's what the UFC is really good at locking down, right? I mean, it's not like Clay Collard beat Anthony Pettis and suddenly he's a household name or he's really picking up in ratings. You've got to get champions and you have to get a fair amount of them all together or bigger names all at once in their prime in order to really compete. And that's I don't know if that's possible. If I'm being blunt, I don't think it is without external help like the antitrust lawsuit. I think let's say the antitrust lawsuit dies or it goes the way of the UFC. I don't see a way that PFL can permeate that brand and that fighter scarcity. Branding would be their only option if they came up with some crazy marketing that just really hooked people in certain ways, right? I mean, they've got Jake Paul, which I think is a smart move on their part, to tap kind of younger and unused, I would say, customer segments by the UFC, right? Like that's really their biggest avenue is trying to find other customer segments that the UFC isn't hitting that they can somehow hit. But if you're talking about straight overlap, I don't think they can win head to head. I don't think acquiring Bellator gives them the boost that they need. Will it boost some ratings? Maybe. But a lot of the hardcore fans were watching Bellator and PFL anyway. Now they'll just have to watch Bellator, or I'm sorry, PFL for the most part. I mean, Bellator will still have shows though. No, so yeah, actually, that's not true. They'll have to watch both still. Um, and again, you'll have cool things like Bellator versus PFL, which you know is a cool concept, and will get hardcores excited. But permeating beyond that will still be very, very tough. I don't see competition happening without the antitrust lawsuit going that way. I just don't. We'll see. I mean, and again, another thing to point out is the space is big enough, right, that PFL can still erode some of the UFC market share just from being an alternative. And if the sport's popularity grows, then again, you get more customers in general, and then that can still increase your revenue and you can still be successful. It doesn't mean you can't be successful if you're PFL. I'm not saying that. But to be a true co-leader and challenge the UFC, I don't think it's possible. Antitrust lawsuit gets rid of contracts, whole different ball game. Or punitive damages in that are just so high that all of a sudden UFC is forced to, go through a reckoning of releasing fighters and it causes, bankruptcy issues or restructuring. Okay, then we're talking about some game changers. But until that happens, I don't see it. I don't see it, y'all. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if this all made sense. I know I messed up some labeling. I apologize. But let me know if this makes sense to you. If you understand this competitive advantage and strategic analysis. One thought I want to leave you guys with is something I mentioned before, but I think bears repeating, at least on this topic. What Kevin Coyne says regarding competitive advantages that a lot of people think, okay, you get this advantage and then people find ways to disrupt it or cause issues and they lose it. They always have to keep fighting for it. But the opposite is actually true. Is generally once a company has a competitive advantage, unless they have outside interference, aka a antitrust lawsuit, or rapid technological shift, right? Streaming, cable, DVD, VHS to DVD, internet, things of that nature. Um, Generally, a company will continue to hold that competitive advantage and it will only result in greater advantage down the line, right? All other variables equal. If a company has a competitive advantage, it isn't usually that a competitor comes in and finds a way to disrupt or take away that advantage. They often, in most scenarios, keep that advantage and only grows larger. That's important to remember. Even when they do disrupt, right? When we're talking about competitive game theory, in most examples, when McKinsey did a giant study amongst companies, most examples, there's only 2 or 3 moves, right? So UFC might do this, PFL might respond this way, or vice versa, and then that's either it or maybe UFC responds one more time. In very rare instances, it goes beyond that, but it's not this constant like, oh, well, Burger King did this, so McDonald's needs to do this, or Walgreens did this, so CVS is this, and they go back and forth. This endless war. Like, no, they compete and they have different things they compete on, but it's usually just 2 or 3 steps. And so keep in mind that if PFL does manage to disrupt the UFC in some form or fashion, UFC will almost certainly respond. And then it will be up to PFL to make another move. And that may be it. Or they might not be able to make another move because of the costs associated with it. Because that's a huge part of why in competitive game theory, you don't have companies just take shots at each other like they do in cartoons, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Because there's costs associated with that. So keep that all in mind because again, without some outside interference, I don't know how the UFC loses these competitive advantages, especially to a company that still is in this stage. Long term, 50 years down the line, sure. 15, 20 even. Okay, maybe they're able to slowly chip away, but I can't see them competing anytime soon. All right, we're briefly going to talk about the Middle East as the new combat sports hub slash capital, right? Being called the new fight capital of the world. Sports Business Journal had a couple articles about this. There are a lot of people who have talked about this. You've got Fury and Ngannou. You've got other boxing matches happening. You've got UFC already had their deal with Abu Dhabi, but now they have a deal with Saudi Arabia. You have PFL doing their deal with Saudi Arabia and creating a league out there. Going into new markets is nothing new, right? As I wrote about for what feels like eons ago about the UFC going into Russia, right? And kind of penetrating that market at the time, especially trying to get Habib Nurmagomedov as kind of a champion for that region. Um, Going into new markets is nothing new. You want to get sponsorships, you want to get TV rights. China is a huge example, right? Dana White even mentioned with some of their, with Abu Dhabi, how they kind of were again an other partnership resource and revenue driver. Where they made some of the connections and inroads into China, which has now led to Wei Li being champion. And once she got her initial title, you doubled up on the television rights. She's huge on Weibo. I mean, it's helped them penetrate a whole new market, right? It's nothing new going into these regions. But what is new is generally most of the more wealthy countries had already been kind of saturated in terms of MMA promotion, right? Think of the US, which is by far the most expensive place to watch MMA because you got to pay for ESPN Plus and then also for the pay-per-views. Like you're not paying that same pay-per-view price in the UK or other areas. But again, if you're going to a show in the UK, that's obviously still expensive. Or in Paris or some of these other regions they've gone to, Europe, really Australia, right? Um, the more richer nations have already kind of, been under the UFC's thumb, or at least have had a fair amount of their market share, given to the UFC, right? There's just some article today. I didn't get to read through it all, but I know Mark Shapiro was talking about it with TKO about the site fees that UFC is getting, which is something like $16 million from Australia, which is huge, right? And that's something that PFL will hopefully one day want to do, and others would love to do, is to have these side fees. But the Middle East is a place that generally was avoided due to political tensions, and kind of certain perceptions. Where with that stigma gone, it's an endless amount of revenue, and with sports washing happening. Highly recommend some of the articles Kareem Zidane has done discussing, the Middle East and part of what they're doing with sports washing. And we've seen this, with Chechnya too, and Ramazan Kadyrov, fighters going out there and trying to kind of steer away from some of the, terrible things a place has done by saying, look at like the good we're doing here in the sport, right? And look at the opportunities here for the sport. With that being a prime tool and competition between Middle East countries as well, right? With World Cup going to Qatar, and now Saudi Arabia has won, I believe, the 2034 World Cup bid. And those two, keep in mind, there's a whole rivalry between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and some of the other Middle East countries and sheiks too, right? Um, I mean, we're talking just wealth beyond wealth beyond wealth from oil and riches and sheiks that have ungodly amounts of money, right? Just ungodly amount families with ungodly amounts of money and kingdoms with ungodly amounts of money. This is a market that is important because even if you're able to take just a small, like 20% of the market, right? That's could equal huge revenue. And that's part of why it's the new fight capital of the world and everybody's all in on it, because it's a race to how can we get deals done with these governments. They're handing out money. They want more events here. Let's get these done and let's get a huge amount of influx. I mean, the only way PFL bought Bellator was because of the Qatar investment, right? And when you're talking about the Abu Dhabi deal with the UFC and Fight Island and some of the other things, I mean, that's been a huge driver of revenue for the UFC, especially during the pandemic, was massive. And so now they've got a Saudi deal, WWE, right? Like the Crown Jewel and Greatest Royal Rumble and all this stuff. I mean, is a massive, massive, massive amount of money for the WWE. That's why you see retired wrestlers who have no business coming back and promise they never would come back go do awful matches in Crown Jewel because they're getting paid obscene amounts of money, more money than WrestleMania, more money than all that stuff because it's a ridiculously rich country that's mostly untapped and is just now being utilized. So I foresee this to continue. I foresee this to be the new battleground for quite some time because, again, why would I spend a ton of money and cost and infrastructure trying to go into a place like, say, India, at least right now, where they're still developing and trying to get to that more richer economic status? Why would I go there, even though the population is huge and I could become, massive in that space, but they don't have the revenue to justify it, right? When I can go to Saudi Arabia and put on a couple shows a year and make way more money than I would in India right now or parts of Africa, right? Like, I mean, it's just, it makes sense. Don't get me wrong. I think India will become a new target market. It's just not their time. But 10 years from now, yeah, I would imagine so. Maybe sooner. Um, but the Middle East is full of money and full of people wanting sports to be brought there. It's not surprising that PFL and UFC have gotten a deal done, and that there were rumors that one was possibly looking at a deal there too, right? It's not shocking at all. And I would imagine everybody's going to try and get as much of the pie as they want. Because even if you get a sliver, if you get a Middle East sliver, it's pretty nice financially. So expect events to be in the Middle East regularly and to only increase. I imagine you're going to get far more UFC Saudi Arabia or UFC of Middle East events per year. Uh, PFL obviously has their own league. They're trying to really cultivate the region and become the brand there, which is good because, that is an area that's still semi untapped. So they're hoping to get some audience there. And that's that's an, it's a customer segment with a lot of disposable income. So it's something good to target. And that's a way they could slowly start to, erode UFC market share, become a co-leader. But it's going to be the new battleground for quite some time, guys. It's lots of Middle East stuff is coming. It's everybody talked about China forever. A lot of things did go to China. A lot of marketing and businesses and all this stuff. I think Middle East is the new, especially for sports, is the new place, right? I mean, you got Liv, you got Messi getting a huge offer. Ronaldo's. I mean, Middle East is going to be the new like it place for at least the next 5 years, I would imagine. So get ready for some different time zones for cards if you're used to them in the US. That would be my guess. All right, last but not least, and I know we're running a little long here, so I'll try to make it a little bit quick. Um, we need to talk about the antitrust lawsuit update. So, uh, UFC had tried to pull out a couple of stops here. They tried to reopen discovery, which was denied, basically as a stall tactic. At least that's how it was perceived. I would agree that's probably what it was. And now they have filed another summary for summary dismissal because Endeavor is saying that most of these allegations occurred when Endeavor only owned, 50% of it or whatever. That really only like 50.1% only really occurred in 2014, 2016, whatever it was. And so most of these things occurred when Zuffa was in charge. So Zuffa is really who should be at the center of this investigation and or not investigation, allegations, not Endeavor. This really is an Endeavor's thing. We came in afterwards, is what they're saying. It's an interesting ploy. It's telling of how the UFC feels things are probably going right now. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in regards to that. Because obviously, if Endeavor is able to dismiss it on those grounds, Zuffa could be in trouble, which would be the Fertitas and Dana White. But Endeavor itself, who now owns the UFC, not so much, which would negate a lot of the potential negative impacts to the UFC, i.e., contract stuff and all that fun stuff. Zuffa would be on the hook for a lot of money. It would be a whole thing. So, with that in mind, we'll see where that summary judgment goes. Right now, we do have trial, or at least a tentative trial schedule, with the trial to begin April 8th. So that's pretty big. A lot of pre-trial discovery and all that stuff starting in the new year. So just a month away, which will be very interesting, and I will be on top of. But one thing I wanted to call out was, in these motions, there were a fair amount of exhibits attached with specific information. John Nash, as always, head of the game, has a lot of the juicier exhibits out there. But we're going to go through some of those, but I also found a couple that he didn't cover that I want to make sure we address. So, with that in mind, and again, these are all out on Twitter, and then we'll put up the 2 or 3 that I have that aren't. But when you're looking at some of the ones that Nash pulled up, right? He's pulling things that were attached in the response, plaintiffs put in the response, where it's pretty damning in terms of the antitrust aspect of it, and goes back to that competitive advantage and securing that competitive advantage of scarcity of fighter resources. So one is a view on Zuffa's strategy towards Brazil, right, where it says, to Zuffa's position in the long run, it's important to keep UFC as the only viable alternative to a top tier fighter career. The surge of a new organization could create a new alternative to new talented fighters to have a full career outside of the UFC. For its long-term success, Zuffa needs to make sure that no new Anderson Silva or John Jones is developed outside of the organization. The risk is to allow a disproportionate share of value created by the business to migrate from Zuffa to fighters or other actors in the industry in a process of disintermediation. This becomes especially dangerous when the UFC creates myths. GSP, Anderson, Jones. That ties back to what I was telling before. They don't want people to be McGregor fans or Silva fans, because if those fighters leave, they stop watching the UFC. They go wherever the fighters go. They want the UFC to be the brand. That's part of why the UFC has slowed down marketing on newer fighters. People are like, why aren't they pushing? I'm trying to think who. I mean, Izzy to an extent got some push, but a lot of people were like, why not more? Right? Aaron Blanchfield, the couple up and coming contenders, right? Where there have been always questions like, why wouldn't you push so and so? Aspinall, Tom Aspinall, why wouldn't you push Aspinall more? They don't want Aspinall to be a star on his own. They want it to be tied to the UFC. They don't want McGregor's and Rousey's and even Diaz's, right? They're past that. They now have the set fixed revenue. They want fighters to be interesting enough to draw fans, but they want those fans to be more tied to the UFC than the fighters. This just confirms that, right? Another thing here is there are a couple documents in terms of Strikeforce stuff that's interesting, and kind of mimics what the PFL is trying to do in terms of acquiring as many fighters as you could through other organizations to kind of challenge the UFC's dominance in that scarcity. But we've already really covered where they are with that. There are some interesting things on fighter percentage pay, right? Fighter revenue share compared to boxing, which is the most comparable. When you look at some of these, you've got economists saying that, fighter revenue share could be anywhere from 60% as high as 85%. So fighters would get 85%, promoters get 15. Obviously, that's not the case for the UFC, which, they have tables produced by themselves internally that percent of total revenue going to fighters and to actual, uh, employees and all that stuff, 18.6% for fighters. That's significantly lower than team sports. They had it. Mercer, who is a consultant, go in and say, like, in terms of individual and event-based revenue is going more towards the fighters, but team sports, it's significantly cheaper percentage. And again, when you think about the UFC, it's essentially its own league, and that helps quite a bit. I mean, again, some of these tables are fighter share in revenue in year 2016, 22.2%, NFL 47, NHL 51, NBA 47, boxing 62. I mean, that's definitely looking like wage suppression and kind of lends credence to some of the arguments. Um, but it's not. Uh, it's not something the UFC can really afford to lose at this point, given the way they've structured their business. Right? They're public now, and if they had to increase fighter share, that would hurt their bottom line. That would hurt their stock price, which hurts money coming in. It's not a fun time for them. They've kind of everybody is always saying like, why don't they just give them money? They have so much money. They could. Don't get me wrong. They easily could, but from a business perspective, especially now that they're public, not what they want to do because it's all about growth, right? I mean, I can't reiterate that enough. It's all about growth. If you're not growing, you're dying. I think those are most of Nash's documents that I wanted to look over. I'm double checking. I'm not missing anything here. There were a couple notes right from a very interesting one I almost forgot was in terms of pride, right? There's an email here that was attached that essentially is from a consultant, which again, you bring in consultants to help you do acquisitions, right? You'll hear about JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs helping with an acquisition from one big company to another. And uh, when talking in regards to UFC buying Pride, there's an email here that essentially says it's highlighted given the strategic slash preemptive nature of this acquisition, i.e., to stop others from buying it, and you're having seriously contemplated acquiring them only to shut their business down and utilize the fighters in the UFC. We set a low threshold of due diligence, which again, due diligence is making sure that everything's above board on the financials that are presented to them, etc. And this is pretty damning because it's basically saying you only want to, because you've let me know, right, that you only want to buy this promotion, possibly to just use these fighters in your own company and not to actually own this company, just basically to shut down a competitor. That's not great in an antitrust lawsuit. That's all I'll say about that. But that seems pretty straightforward, right? There's also, Deutsche Bank comments about a huge part of, their ability to retain talent within the company is key to the UFC being as good as they are and growing, which again, that's keeping the scarcity of the top tier fighters under their umbrella is the exclusive contracts. Highlighted here, UFC athlete contracts are designed to retain talent within the company. Most contracts are 2 years in length with exclusivity clause that prevent fighters from moving to different MMA organizations while under contract and with negotiation and matching rights after the agreement expires. Additionally, contracts typically give the UFC the right to release athletes after 1 or 2 fights on the basis of poor performance, providing the company increased flexibility. Furthermore, the UFC typically has the right to retain athletes who hold the championship title. So, I mean, again, that kind of restrictiveness is huge. And, to further cement that, and again, go back to our competitive analysis, some of the documents that I found attached to this that I want to bring up is one, in terms of just, competition itself, a very interesting email from Victor Cui of ONE FC to Mark Fisher of the UFC with a highlighted portion that says, unlike other, this is back in 2011, but again, this is still at a time, and since ONE has said they want to, they're different than the UFC, they want to differentiate themselves, but in this email, they say, unlike other organizations, ONE FC has no intent on competing with the UFC, and I am always open to any initiatives you may have in mind. I believe that ONE FC is well positioned to be a feeder organization to the UFC. If you have any interest in any of our fighters, I would be more than willing to offer them to the UFC and support you in as many ways as possible. That's from ONE Championship. And again, it's 10 years ago, but it just highlights the market share and the power that the UFC has. That in order for ONE to grow, they're trying to say, look, we're not trying to ruffle your feathers and be a problem for you. In fact, if you want to take some of our fighters, we're more than happy to work out deals. We'll be a feeder league. That just shows the barriers to and competitive advantages the UFC have, right? I mean, this is like what PFL is trying to do is not easy. Um, Another thing that backs this up is a disposition, not dissertation. Which I'm trying to remember his last name. Kurt Otto. There's an exhibit filed with a disposition of him with a couple of key pieces in that disposition. Um, in regards to how it would be tough for IFL, International Fight League, which if any of you remember that years ago, 2009, I think 2008 or 2006 through 2008, they died in 2009, was a competitor that had a league similar. It was team based, right? It was a little bit different, but it was similar ish in idea to PFL, at least from a league standpoint and points instead of just individual competition. And Kurt Otto's deposition, he's asked certain questions. A couple of them being, you know, so in order to compete on the level of the UFC, you need a ton of capital. Is that right? Is the question the lawyer asked. And Otto says, yeah, to start off with. And then he's followed up with, you said to start off with a ton of capital. Yes. And Otto goes on to say, yes, to get that machine going so that you can prove to the TV network that you have the wherewithal to actually put on an event. Not just a one-off situation. I'm talking about a season. Talking about I'm going to deliver you 35 shows. Follow-up question, you need a top-level fighter. You need a lot of top-level fighters in order to get the TV contract. Is that right? His answer is, it's all linked. And you need the TV contract, the lawyer says. He says yes. And then he goes on to say, and then the TV networks get upset if they can't sell time to Gatorade, the beer companies, the popcorn companies, and the muscle milk, the head blade, whatever. So if someone is blocking you from doing that, it's a challenge. Lawyer follows up, hard to compete if you have a competitor out there blocking you from getting top sponsors. Is that right? He says, is that 100% right? That's another portion we haven't even talked about, but that's part of the competitive landscape, right? If I'm the UFC and I have a deal with Bud Light isn't going to go do a deal with PFL because the UFC probably says in their agreement, you can't go sponsor PFL or XYZ or whatever, right? Maybe they can to an extent, right? And one of their subsidiaries could, sure, but I mean, if it's getting into true competition, UFC, I'm sure, has clauses and relationships that say, no, if you want us to re-up here, if you want us to really help your brand image, Bud Light, and all this other stuff, you've got to stay away from our competitors. And as Otto points out here, Kurt Otto, that, if you can't get those top sponsorships, you can't get that base foundation revenue. Laura goes on to say, sounds like there's a bit of a catch-22 because it's hard to get the top level fighters unless you're already an established business with a top TV contract. It's hard to get a TV contract unless you have top level fighters. And he goes on to say, is essentially something of yes, because people, that's part of the catch-22. There's a couple other things here, right? Question given by lawyer, why would it have been important to the IFL or any upstart MMA promotion to recruit and retain well-known MMA fighters? He said, well, it only matters, in my opinion, only matters two things, ticket sales and TV revenue. Yeah, so if you have a great fighter and you have revenue to pay for that fighter, they're worth because they put butts in the seats or have purchased for pay-per-view, et cetera, it's everything. It's the gasoline to the engine. Without that, you have zero. It's the epitome of the sport, is what he says, which again goes back to the revenue streams, right? When we talk about media rights and pay-per-views, which are two of the biggest streams, you need top fighters. And the UFC has used their competitive advantage of creating a scarcity for top fighters and an asymmetry that they only have them. It's hard for other organizations to come in and compete. It's all interlinked. Gasoline for the engine. That's the revenue drivers, fighters, and partnerships, revenue streams, pay-per-views, media rights, sponsorships, right? So it's all interlinked like that. And again, this just is a bigger view of what the UFC has been able to do up until now, at least through 2017 that we know of, and how they've been able to create these huge competitive advantages. I know I'm running long, so I'm going to wrap this up, but those are the antitrust lawsuits suit updates for now. I will continue to go through docs and update them throughout the weeks. Let me know if you have any questions on those particular docs and this update. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. Trial date's coming up. The fact that pretrial discovery and all that other stuff is happening next month is important. Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. You basically got a 2-for-1 for this. I know I went on some rabbit holes, but I hope you all loved it. I appreciate you for watching on YouTube. Like, subscribe if you haven't already. If you're listening on Stitcher, Spotify, what have you, always appreciate you guys as always. Got any questions? Let me know. I know I went in deep on some of this stuff. I apologize if I rambled a little bit, but I get excited about the stuff. You know how it is. I'm a business head. Love talking to you guys. Love to be back. And until next time, get money.